Okay, so get ready to dive deep. Today, we're tackling the Iraq War. But get this, we're looking at it through the lens of the butterfly effect.
Uh-huh. It's such an interesting way to unpack this period in history. It reminds us that what happens in international relations, well, it's never really isolated. Everything's like interconnected.
Right. And the article you sent over, it really zeroes in on the Gulf War. Back in the early 90s, that's our starting point. I mean, we all remember that, right? Pushing Saddam Hussein's forces back from Kuwait. But there's this what if the article throws out there.
Yeah, it kind of dives into this scenario, and I think, a lot of analysts have kind of thought about this. What if back then the U.S. and its allies, what if they decided to, fully remove Hussein from power, not just stop the invasion?
Yeah, instead of leaving him in charge. That's a big what if. Yeah.
It is. And the article suggests that, this decision made sense at the time. Nobody wanted to get bogged down in a long conflict, but it might have accidentally created this power vacuum that, let's be honest, Hussein was definitely the kind of guy to take advantage of.
So you're saying if we'd taken a different path back then, things might have gone way differently later on?
Well, it's impossible to say for sure, obviously. But the article makes a really strong case that leaving Hussein in power had huge consequences throughout the 90s and even beyond.
Okay, so let's get into the 90s then. We've got the UN in Iraq doing those weapons inspections, making sure Hussein wasn't, developing any weapons of mass destruction.
Right, and this is where the article takes that what if even further, What if Iraq had been totally open, cooperative with those inspections? We're talking complete transparency. The article argues that the 2000s, they might have played out completely differently.
Whoa, okay, you're blowing my mind here. It's actually kind of hard to even imagine that scenario now.
Right, but think about it. The whole uncertainty around Iraq's WMD program, that became the main reason for the 2003 invasion, right? So even if Hussein was still in charge, if they'd been totally transparent, would the world have been so gung-ho about military action 10 years later? I don't know. The article suggests that just the lack of transparency itself, that played a role in how people saw Iraq.
So it wasn't just whether Iraq actually had WMDs, it was the fact that nobody knew for sure. That's a scary thought.
Totally. And the article points out that intelligence gathering back then, it was a mess. Iraq was actively trying to mislead everyone, made it super hard to figure out what was true. It was all part of what they call the fog of war, where even with good intentions, sometimes you just don't have all the facts.
Okay, so we've got this what if building on top of the decision to leave Hussein in power after the Gulf War. And then, as if things weren't already complicated enough, 9/11 happens.
And that's where things get really interesting. See, even though Iraq wasn't directly involved in 9/11, those attacks totally changed how the U.S. saw the world. It's like they were looking through a new lens, especially when it came to threats.
Right, the whole global chessboard got shaken up, and suddenly everything looked different.
Exactly. The attacks, they brought about the war on terror, this global thing where the U.S. and its allies became way more willing to hit for, preemptively take out threats before they could attack. That was a big change. Suddenly, any country that seemed hostile or maybe hiding terrorists, they were in the crosshairs. And Iraq, well, let's just say a lot of people already saw them as a problem, so they fit right into that category. And that's where all those earlier decisions, they kind of come together in a big way. The article talks about how that fog of war, plus everyone freaking out after 9/11, it led to this idea that Iraq, they had WMDs. People like Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, those guys in the Bush administration, they were positive about it.
Yeah, it's easy to look back now and be like, what were they thinking? But the article does a good job of showing the vibe back then.
Totally. And that's what makes the butterfly effect so important here. Even though the intelligence was iffy and Iraq was trying to trick everyone, that belief that they had WMDs, it took over. And of course, well, we know how that turned out. Tragically wrong.
Right. And the article doesn't sugarcoat it. Those consequences were awful. But it also brings up something I hadn't thought about much. Even if the intelligence was right, even if Iraq did have WMDs, there's this other thing.
You mean what happens after you take out Hussein?
Exactly. It seems like everyone was so focused on the WMDs that nobody really planned for what came next. How do you rebuild a whole country?
It's this thing that happens over and over, right? Getting rid of a dictator, that's huge. But then actually building a normal, peaceful country, that's the hard part. And the article really makes it clear that the U.S. and its allies, they were not ready for that in Iraq.
Yeah, the article uses this phrase, it's kind of grim. It says that with Hussein gone and no plan for what came next, It was like inviting chaos and violence in.
And that's where those early what-ifs, that's where they come back to bite you. Those ripples, those things you didn't expect, they don't just vanish, they make it easy for new problems to pop up, and those new problems are often way worse.
And that takes us to, well, the rise of ISIS. This is where the butterfly effect gets really disturbing.
It's a straight line. Even if it wasn't obvious right away, think about it. All that instability after the invasion, all the fighting between different groups in Iraq, it was a tragedy. But it also created the perfect conditions for a group like ISIS to take hold.
It's like this horrible side effect, this thing that nobody wanted, but it grew out of all the bad decisions that came before.
Yeah, and the article points out it didn't stop at Iraq's borders either. The whole world reacted to the war, and not in a good way.
Right, there was a huge backlash.
Totally. The U.S., they took a hit with their allies, some of whom were saying from the beginning this is a bad idea. And then you had a lot of anti-Western sentiment in other parts of the world, people saying, see, this is how the West operates, like bullies.
So not only was it devastating inside Iraq, but the U.S. lost standing in the world too.
Exactly. The article talks about America's soft power, meaning their ability to kind of persuade other countries to do things their way without using force. That took a hit, which made it harder for the U.S. to get things done internationally afterwards.
The article gives some specific examples, like other countries didn't trust U.S. leadership as much, and they were less likely to go along with U.S. plans, even if those plans might have been seen as good before. It's like the trust was broken.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. And of course, we got to talk about the human cost. The article says maybe over 100,000 Iraqi civilians died because of the war, plus millions who had to leave their homes.
It's mind-blowing. And I think it's easy to get caught up in all the politics, all the what-ifs, but at the end of the day, it's real people who suffer in these situations.
No question, you can't put a price on a human life, and it's something we can't ever forget. And it's not just those who died, right? The article talks about how Iraqi society was messed up, the damage, people traumatized, like whole generations will be dealing with this.
Yeah, it makes you realize that wars, you can't just measure them in money or even how many people die right away. The effects, they just keep going.
Right, and speaking of money, the Iraq War, it cost a fortune, like trillions of dollars, according to the article. Added a ton to the U.S. debt.
Yeah, and that became a big political issue here in the U.S., didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. People were arguing about the war's cost, obviously the human cost too, but also the money. It made everyone rethink, like, what should the U.S. be doing in the world? Can we afford this kind of intervention?
So, big picture, the Iraq War, it wasn't just one thing, right? Not one decision, one what if. It was this whole chain of events going back years, each one leading to the next.
And that's the butterfly effect in action, right? Something that seems small, insignificant even, can end up changing the course of history in ways you'd never imagine.
Like that saying, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. You know how it goes.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, what are we doing now that'll seem huge years from now? What are the butterflies we don't even notice until it's too late?
Whoa. That's a question to think about. And it shows how important it is to really think about our choices, not just for now, but for the long haul, especially when it comes to global stuff.
Because the Iraq War proves it. Those ripples, they go on and on.
They really do. Well, this has been a deep dive for sure. Thanks for breaking it all down. It's a lot to process, but really important.
You got it. If anything, I hope this reminds people that the world's all connected and we have to learn from history, because it's still shaping our world today.